Caroline was a ghost, long before the fog swallowed her whole. At 16, she possessed the unsettling stillness of someone who had seen too much of the hardscrabble life in the Ozarks of 1915. The air in Silver Hill, Arkansas, was thick with the dust of the newly built railroad and the stale scent of unfulfilled promises. The town was a brutal tapestry of lumber mills and isolated farms, where news traveled slow and secrets settled deep into the cracked earth. Her father, Elias Vance, a man whose spirit had been crushed by a lifetime of failed mining ventures, barely spoke anymore. He saw his daughter not as a girl, but as a silent echo of the land's persistent refusal to yield. Caroline, in turn, found solace in the vast, unforgiving wilderness surrounding their small cabin, a landscape of ancient trees and jagged limestone that felt more honest than the deceitful warmth of human contact. The incident began not with a scream, but with a whisper passed through the mill workers. "They're here." The strangers were 3 men from Little Rock, well-dressed but reeking of city ambition. Mr. Sterling, the self-proclaimed expedition leader, wore a heavy tweed coat and carried maps that looked laughably inadequate for the terrain. He was flanked by Mr. Thorne, a nervous accountant whose spectacles magnified his fear, and Mr. Graves, a silent, hulking man hired for muscle, whose eyes never seemed to focus on anything specific. They were here on a fool's errand, driven by an old miner's tale of a lost vein of zinc ore hidden deep in the hills, somewhere near the infamous Black Ridge. They needed a guide. Not just any local, but someone who knew the land's treacheries, the sinkholes, the sudden storms, the disorienting, suffocating fog that rolled in from the river bottoms without warning. Elias Vance, recognizing the glint of desperation in Sterling's eyes, pushed Caroline forward. "She knows the trails better than any of us. Born to the hollows she was." Caroline didn't object. She met Sterling's gaze with an unnerving flat indifference. The pay they offered, a handful of silver dollars, was enough to buy their way through the coming winter, a necessity that overshadowed her deep, visceral reluctance. The day they set out, the weather was ominous. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air was heavy, smelling of ozone and wet decay. As they left the familiar dirt track and plunged into the winding, overgrown paths, the town of Silver Hill seemed to shrink instantly, replaced by the relentless, encroaching forest. Sterling tried to make light conversation, peppering her with condescending questions about the local flora and fauna. Caroline offered only one-word answers, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The map he carried was useless. She moved with an instinctive grace, avoiding roots and loose stones, her small frame leading the 3 large, clumsy men deeper into the silence. Around mid-afternoon, they reached the base of Black Ridge. The trees here were older, the canopy so dense that the light was reduced to a sickly greenish gloom. It was here that the fog began its insidious advance. It didn't roll, it simply materialized, a white, cold blanket that snaked through the undergrowth, instantly muffling sound and blurring vision. "Wait a moment," Sterling coughed, pulling his coat tighter, the air now biting cold. "The visibility is dropping fast. Where's this vein you spoke of, Miss Vance? We need to establish a camp." Caroline stopped dead, her back to them. The silence that followed was broken only by Thorne's ragged breathing. "We are close," she said, her voice thin and strange in the dense air. "Closer than you know." She turned, and for the first time, the men saw a flicker of something unsettling in her eyes, a strange, triumphant energy that contradicted her usual vacant demeanor. She pointed a slender finger into the white mass of the fog, towards a dense thicket of tangled briars. "That's the way," she stated. Sterling hesitated, peering into the swirling mist that had reduced their world to 10 feet of visibility. He saw no path, only a wall of thorns. "Are you certain, girl? This looks like a dead end." A barely perceptible smile touched Caroline's lips. It was chilling. "It's the only way, Mr. Sterling. You wanted the Ozarks. The Ozarks give you what you want." Without waiting for a response, she stepped into the fog. She didn't walk. She seemed to dissolve. The sound of her boots on the dry leaves vanished almost immediately, leaving the three men alone, surrounded by an oppressive, freezing silence. "Caroline, wait!" Sterling yelled, his voice sounding weak and desperate. They plunged after her, driven by the lure of the zinc and the sudden, irrational fear of being abandoned. They called out, their voices swallowed by the relentless fog. They stumbled through the briars, their expensive clothes snagging, their confidence rapidly dissolving into raw panic. After 5 minutes of blind, frantic pushing, Sterling stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Thorne, whose face was pale and slick with cold sweat. "Did you see which way she went?" Sterling demanded. Thorne shook his head, whimpering. "She just vanished, Sterling. Like smoke." Graves, the muscle, was rubbing his thick neck, his eyes wide and vacant. "I don't hear nothing." They were utterly alone. The fog was now so thick that they could barely see each other's faces. Caroline Vance, the quiet girl who knew the secrets of the hills, had led them into the heart of the great white void and simply disappeared. The terrifying question was not where she had gone, but why she had brought them here, to this suffocating, isolated place. The first faint, distant sound they heard was not Caroline's voice, but a strange, rhythmic tapping, like metal on stone, echoing from an unknown direction in the swirling, cold blindness. The sound was too slow for an animal, too deliberate for the wind. It was a terrifying, unmistakable promise. If you've been gripped by the mystery of Caroline's disappearance and the fate of the strangers in the Ozark fog, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next as the suspense deepens. The rhythmic tapping sound persisted, echoing in the thick Ozark fog like a maddening metronome. It wasn't the sound of work, but something far more deliberate and unnerving. Mr. Sterling gripped the expensive compass he carried, its needle spinning wildly, useless against the magnetic interference of the deep minerals beneath Black Ridge. "That girl, she did this on purpose," he hissed, his voice trembling. His earlier condescension had been replaced by a raw, unvarnished terror. Mr. Thorne, the accountant, was hyperventilating, wiping the condensation from his spectacles. "A trick. It has to be a local trick. They lure prospectors, rob them." "Rob them of what, Thorne? She disappeared before she could take anything," Sterling countered, though the argument offered little comfort. He looked at Mr. Graves, the silent muscle who was now a liability. Graves was staring into the white wall of fog, his large frame rigid with a fear that bypassed logic. "The tapping," Graves mumbled, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "It's too regular. Sounds like someone marking time." Sterling forced himself to think. He was a businessman, a man of logic and ledgers, not folklore. Caroline Vance was a local girl, not a spirit. She must have known a hidden path, a quick way to vanish and observe them. "We stick together. We don't move until the fog lifts. Panic is how we lose our way and fall down one of those sinkholes Elias warned about." But the fog, relentless and heavy, showed no sign of dissipating. It pressed in, amplifying the cold and the silence between the taps. Sterling pulled out his revolver, a small, polished, nickel-plated weapon that felt absurdly inadequate against the vastness of the wilderness. "We call out. We make noise. She'll have to answer or show herself." They began to shout, "Caroline, Vance, we'll double the money. Show yourself." Their voices were swallowed instantly. The only reply was the unwavering tap, tap, tap. After 20 minutes of futile shouting and the unbearable suspense of the tapping, Thorne cracked, "I can't take this silence. We have to move. If we freeze, we die." Thorne made a panicked lunge toward where he thought the main path was, tripping over a hidden root. He fell hard, his glasses flying off into the wet undergrowth. "My glasses, I can't see a thing." Thorne scrabbled blindly, his hands tearing at the dirt. Sterling grabbed him by the collar, hauling him back. "Stop it. Get a hold of yourself, man. If we split up, we're finished." But as he pulled Thorne, they both heard a new sound, much closer. A low, rhythmic dragging sound, a heavy weight being pulled over the uneven ground. It was coming from the direction of the tapping, and it was getting closer. Graves finally moved, not toward the sound, but away from it. He shoved Sterling violently aside, his eyes wide with a primal animal terror. "Something's out there. I ain't staying for it." The hulking man plunged back into the fog, running in a direction that was almost certainly wrong, his heavy footsteps rapidly receding. Sterling, stunned, scrambled to retrieve his gun, which had clattered on the ground. "Graves, get back here, you coward." Silence. Graves was gone. Now, it was just Sterling and the near-blind, sobbing Thorne. The dragging sound intensified, and the tapping stopped. It was close. Too close. "Sterling, what if it's not the girl?" Thorne whispered, clutching his coat sleeve. "What if she led us to something else? Something hiding in these hills?" Sterling aimed his small revolver into the fog. He knew the stories. Hermits, moonshiners, men who had fled the law or society, hiding for decades, their minds warped by isolation and desperation. In 1915, the Ozarks were still a wild frontier for those seeking to disappear. The dragging stopped directly in front of them. The air grew colder. Sterling squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to rely on his hearing. He heard a deep, rattling inhale, like dry paper being crumpled. He fired the gun once, the shot deafening and futile in the heavy air. A heavy object struck the ground near their feet with a sickening thud. Thorne screamed, a high-pitched, pathetic sound. Sterling dropped to his knees, frantically wiping the fog from his eyes, trying to see what he had hit or what had been dropped. What lay on the wet leaves was not an animal, not a person, but an object of terrifying familiarity. Mr. Graves's heavy leather satchel, the one filled with their remaining supplies and emergency rations. It was carefully placed in the center of the ground, its strap neatly wrapped around the handle. And lying next to the satchel, positioned like a grotesque warning, was a single perfectly polished limestone rock, the kind used for marking trails. It was wet, cold, and meticulously clean. Graves was gone. His satchel was here, and whatever had brought it had just breathed. Sterling picked up the rock, his fingers numb. It was too heavy for Caroline to have carried with ease, and too deliberate for an animal. This was the work of a man who was playing with them. A man who was moving with unsettling silence and strength. "It's a game, Thorne," Sterling whispered, his voice catching. "A brutal, sick game." But the terror truly began when Thorne, still searching blindly on the ground, let out a choked cry, not of pain, but of bewildered dread. "Sterling, my glasses, I found them, but they're not broken." Thorne held up his spectacles. The lenses were intact, but they were covered in a thick, dark, oily residue. And clinging to one of the arms was a thin, fine strand of long blonde hair, the exact color of Caroline Vance's. The girl hadn't vanished. She was still here, in the fog, moving in silence, and she was clearly not alone. The tapping had been the sound of their hunter marking the trail. The fog lifted momentarily, a tiny, fleeting gap in the white curtain. Sterling peered through the gap and saw, about 30 yards away, a faint light flickering, like a lantern hanging in the skeletal arms of a giant oak tree. For a split second, he saw a shadow move near the light, a tall, stooped figure, not the slight silhouette of Caroline. Then, the fog closed in again, the moment of clarity gone, replaced by the deep, echoing sound of a heavy shovel striking wet earth. They were not being robbed. They were being buried. The sound of the shovel was the true sound of their doom, far more terrifying than the silent dragging. It was the sound of preparation, of an inevitable finality that negated all hope of rescue. Sterling forced himself to ignore the rising hysteria in Thorne's gasping breaths. He dragged Thorne a few feet away from the abandoned satchel, deeper into the cover of a dense laurel bush. "Quiet. Not a sound, Thorne. We wait for the man with the shovel to pass." But the shoveling didn't pass. It continued, steady and deliberate, a soundtrack to their psychological breakdown. "He knows we're here," Thorne whimpered, clutching the filthy glasses. "He's digging for us." "He's digging something," Sterling corrected, his mind racing to find a rational explanation. "A grave, yes, but maybe for a previous victim, or maybe he's preparing a pit for us. Either way, we don't move until the sound is gone." Sterling's hands went to the blonde hair strand clinging to Thorne's spectacles. Caroline Vance. The girl had led them here, and the evidence suggested she was working with whoever was out there. Why? Was she coerced? Or was she a willing participant in this horrifying ambush? He thought back to Elias Vance, the girl's father, a man broken by the Ozarks, desperate for money. Had he made a pact with a local criminal to lure wealthy city men into the hills? It was a common enough crime in isolated areas, but the method was grotesque. The silent pursuit, the calculated terror, the disappearance into the fog. After what felt like hours, the sound of the shovel suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even heavier than the fog. Sterling waited, counting the seconds, until his nerves were completely frayed. He reached for his pocket watch. It was impossible to tell the time in the oppressive darkness. "We have to risk it," he whispered to Thorne. "We need to get to higher ground. We might catch a break in the fog and get our bearings." They began to crawl on their bellies, moving parallel to where the digging had been, their progress agonizingly slow. Every crack of a twig sounded like a gunshot. The damp earth quickly soaked their clothes, adding a bone-deep chill to their terror. After about 50 yards, the terrain changed. They felt the unmistakable smooth, cold texture of limestone beneath their hands. They had crawled into a small, dry clearing, a natural rock outcropping that offered a tiny respite from the mud and brush. And then, Sterling saw it. Sticking out of a crack in the rock, almost hidden by a patch of moss, was a small, crudely carved wooden doll. It was fashioned from a twig, with tiny bits of cloth tied around it for clothes, and it had 2 small, silver-colored pinheads for eyes. It was a child's toy. As Sterling reached out to touch it, Thorne let out a muffled gasp and pointed a shaking finger at the ground beneath the doll. Scrawled onto the smooth limestone, done with what looked like a piece of charcoal, was a single disturbing sentence. "She brought you here for a reason." The handwriting was neat, clear, and small, not the clumsy scrawl of a desperate hermit, but the careful hand of someone educated, or perhaps someone young. Caroline's hand. The implication hit Sterling with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a kidnapping or a simple robbery. This was retribution. Caroline wasn't a victim. She was the architect of their demise, and this man in the fog, the one with the shovel, was her accomplice. But retribution for what? Sterling and his associates were mere prospectors. They had never met Elias or Caroline Vance before yesterday. Unless... Sterling's memory flashed back to a decade ago, to his own early reckless mining ventures in these very hills. The names of the locals he had cheated, the land he had fraudulently acquired, the small-time miners he had crushed when the railroad came through. The Vance name was common. But a man named Jeremiah Vance had owned a claim, a promising patch of land near Silver Hill, that Sterling and his partners had bought for a pittance using forged papers, effectively condemning Jeremiah to poverty. Elias Vance was Jeremiah's son. The terror was now a cold, sickening realization. This was not random violence. This was a revenge plot, years in the making, meticulously planned. As they absorbed the horror of the message, Thorne's eyes drifted upward, beyond the rock. He pointed. his breath shallow. Hanging from the lowest branch of a nearby hickory tree about 5 feet above their heads was a heavy, dirt-caked miner's pickaxe. It was tied to the branch by a length of old frayed manila rope, positioned perfectly so that if anyone stood up beneath it, the rope would graze their head. And dangling from the handle of the pickaxe, glinting dully in the negligible light, was Mr. Graves's wallet. It was empty of cash, but the identification papers and a small, cherished photograph of his wife were still inside. The trap had been sprung on Graves, not by a sudden attack, but by a chilling, calculated design. They were being stalked, cornered, and terrorized by people who knew the land, who were patient, and who were executing a chilling vendetta. "He's watching us, Thorne," Sterling whispered, clutching the wooden doll. "He wants us to see this. He wants us to know we're next." Suddenly the fog began to thin with terrifying speed, not lifting entirely, but breaking into ragged, swirling columns. The light of the setting sun, a bloody orange hue, filtered through the remaining mist. In the clearing, about 30 yards away, they saw the freshly dug earth. Not a pit, but a shallow, rectangular trench. And standing at the edge of the trench, their silhouette briefly framed by the sickly sunset, were 2 figures. One tall and broad, holding a shovel, and one small and slender, standing utterly still, her blonde hair illuminated by the dying light. Caroline Vance. She was looking directly at them, her expression unreadable, part pity, part cold satisfaction. The man next to her lifted the shovel, not to dig, but to point it directly at Sterling and Thorne, a silent, absolute command. The game was over. The brief, chilling tableau, Caroline Vance and the tall man with the shovel, framed against the sinister Ozark sunset, shattered the last remnants of Sterling's composure. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the man was Elias Vance, Caroline's father. Not the broken, defeated man he'd seen in the town, but a man resurrected by years of resentment and the terrifying clarity of revenge. "Elias!" Sterling choked out, scrambling backward, dragging Thorne with him. "Elias, stop this, we can talk. I'll give you the deed, all of it." The man did not move. He simply stood, a dark silhouette, the shovel a brutal extension of his arm. Caroline remained perfectly still, a silent 16-year-old harbinger of death. The fog rushed back in, thicker and faster than before, as if being actively commanded. The 2 figures vanished, but the message had been delivered. "We have to move, now," Sterling yelled, pushing Thorne toward the direction where they thought the main path might lie. He knew the Vance family wasn't after money alone. They wanted to inflict the same terror and isolation that Sterling's past actions had inflicted on them. They ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, the terror of the pickaxe and the trench driving them forward. They knew the land was their enemy, but staying in the open clearing was an immediate death sentence. After perhaps 10 minutes of frantic flight, they burst out of the dense woods and stumbled onto something unexpected. A narrow, disused logging trail. It was faint, overgrown with moss, but undeniably a path, a lifeline. "This is it. We follow this down," Sterling urged, his chest burning, adrenaline masking the pain. As they ran, the trail wound sharply, and they saw a dilapidated wooden structure ahead, almost swallowed by the woods. It was a small, abandoned logger's shack, the roof partially caved in, the windows boarded up with rotting planks. "Shelter. We can barricade ourselves inside. At least we'll have a wall at our backs." Sterling pulled Thorne toward the shack. Inside, the air was musty and damp, smelling of old pine, mildew, and something acrid, perhaps old oil or chemicals. The floor was dirt, littered with rusty cans and pieces of equipment. They quickly shoved a heavy, broken workbench against the flimsy door. Sterling drew his revolver, the tiny weapon feeling even more ridiculous here. "He won't just let us run," Thorne stammered, his eyes darting frantically at the gaps in the wood. "They're too close, too patient." "Patience is our only weapon now," Sterling said, trying to steady his shaking hands. "We wait for nightfall. We wait for the Vances to make a mistake." As they slumped against the cold, rough-hewn logs, Sterling noticed something strange. In the center of the dirt floor, someone had recently swept the space clean, and in the clean patch, a series of small, deliberate indentations had been made in the earth. Sterling knelt down, running his finger over the marks. They were too regular to be boot prints. They looked like small heel imprints, the kind made by a woman's or a girl's boot. And next to them, drawn with a stick, was a simple, disturbing image. A single, open eye. Caroline had been here. This was not a random safe haven. It was a checkpoint in their twisted hunt. "Thorn, look around. Check the walls. Check the ceiling. Look for anything," Sterling commanded, his voice tight. Thorn, his fear briefly overridden by the urge to survive, began patting the rotting boards of the walls. "Nothing here, just old wood and dust. Wait." Thorn stopped at a spot where a section of the wall looked newer, less weathered than the rest. He pressed hard. The board gave way slightly, revealing a small, dark opening, a peephole. Sterling yanked the board off entirely. Behind it was a crude, small cubbyhole carved into the thick wall. Inside the cubbyhole they found two items. The first was a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with detailed, almost obsessive sketches of the local landscape. Maps of trails, diagrams of sinkholes, and meticulously detailed drawings of their entire journey so far, including the moment they first met Caroline. It was a hunter's journal. And the second item, tucked beneath the notebook, was a heavy, old-fashioned tin box with a rusted latch. Sterling tore open the journal. The handwriting was neat, the language stark and chillingly clinical. He flipped to the most recent entry, dated yesterday. "The strangers are here. They carry the smell of the city and old guilt. She met them at the tracks. The plan proceeds. The fog is coming. The hills demand payment. They will learn what true loss feels like." The realization was complete. This was Elias's journal, detailing their psychological torture. Sterling then focused on the tin box. He fumbled with the rusted latch, his heart pounding. When it finally sprang open, the sight inside was paralyzing. The box contained not money or secrets, but a small, smooth, clean bone, about the size of a thumb, wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. Beside the bone lay a carefully folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline, dated 8 years prior, screamed, "Infant son of Elias Vance, lost in deep hollow accident, town mourns." The article detailed the tragic death of Elias and his wife's infant son, Caleb, who had been lost when a sudden landslide, triggered by an unauthorized explosion from a nearby rival mining crew, had swept away the outbuilding where he was sleeping. The local paper mentioned that the rival crew was connected to several investors from Little Rock. Sterling felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered the explosion, a reckless operation that had saved his partners a great deal of money and had been quietly covered up. He was responsible for the death of Caleb Vance. He looked at the small bone, realizing the horrifying implication. The trench outside was not just a threat. It was an empty space waiting to be filled, a stand-in for the unmarked grave of the son he had indirectly killed. The Vances were not after their lives, but their souls. A deep, scraping sound from the roof above them, followed by the muffled thud of a heavy boot, brought the current horror crashing back. "They're on the roof!" Thorn screamed, clutching the bone and the newspaper clipping like a madman. Sterling looked up, his face slick with sweat. A shadow fell across the ceiling, followed by the sound of a large plank being pried loose, the splintering wood an immediate, undeniable breach of their security. Elias Vance was directly above them, and he was coming in. The splintering wood was deafening in the tiny logger's shack. Elias Vance was tearing open the roof above their heads with shocking speed, his actions driven by a terrifying, cold fury. "He's coming through! We can't stay here!" Sterling yelled, shoving the journal and the grim contents of the tin box into his coat pocket. He glanced at his small revolver. useless against a man with a height advantage and the element of surprise. Thorn, clutching the blue-ribboned bone, was paralyzed, whimpering Caleb's name. The back window is still boarded up. We can break it open and climb out." Sterling grabbed a rusty, broken crowbar from the corner. He lunged at the rear wall, slamming the crowbar against the rotting planks that covered the window opening. The wood was old, but the nails were strong. Above them, a large section of the roof gave way with a crash, showering them in dust, pine needles, and splinters. Through the resulting hole, the massive silhouette of Elias Vance appeared, momentarily outlined against the grey sky. He dropped lightly onto the workbench they had barricaded against the door, his eyes, barely visible in the gloom, locked onto Sterling. Elias did not speak. He simply lifted the heavy, dirt-caked shovel he carried. It wasn't a tool now. It was a bludgeon. "We killed his son, Thorn. This is for Caleb," Sterling screamed, using the guilt as a desperate surge of energy. He slammed the crowbar one last time, and the window planks finally snapped loose, tumbling outward. Go, I'll hold him." Sterling pushed Thorn toward the opening, a hollow gesture of sacrifice born of pure terror. Thorn scrambled through the hole, tearing his jacket, and vanished into the darkening woods. Elias didn't pursue him. His attention remained fixed solely on Sterling. The silence in the shack was absolute, save for their heavy breathing. "You took everything," Elias finally said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, devoid of emotion, making it all the more chilling. "You took the zinc. You took the land. You took the boy." "It was an accident. I didn't know. It was the blast. It wasn't intentional," Sterling pleaded, holding the crowbar uselessly in front of him. "Accident," Elias repeated, the word a soft curse. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Sterling. "Do you think the hills care about your intentions, Sterling?" "They only care about balance." Elias swung the shovel, not at Sterling, but at the lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. The lantern shattered, plunging the shack into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint light from the open door and window. The air was instantly thick with the smell of lamp oil and fear. Sterling dropped the crowbar and scrambled toward the open window, desperate to follow Thorn. But a dark shape moved instantly, blocking his path. Elias had anticipated his move. A heavy fist slammed into Sterling's jaw. The force sent him reeling back against the wall. As Sterling collapsed, he saw in the faint light a brief, horrifying sight. Elias Vance was wearing thick leather work gloves, the knuckles scarred and rough. And around his wrist, secured tightly, was a loop of old manila rope, the same rope that had held the pickaxe in Graves's wallet. Elias had been setting the traps, moving silently, covering his tracks, his massive strength and familiarity with the terrain, making him an unstoppable predator. Before Sterling could recover, Elias grabbed a length of rope from the workbench and with practiced ease bound Sterling's hands tightly behind his back. He then secured a length of the rough rope around Sterling's neck, not tight enough to choke him, but enough to control his movements. "Where is the other one?" Elias demanded, his breath hot and smelling of decay. "Thorn? I don't know. He ran into the woods." Sterling spat out. Elias gripped the rope around Sterling's neck and hauled him to his feet. "He ran the way I wanted him to run. And I know where he's going. We're going to follow him. You're bait, Sterling." Elias began to drag Sterling out of the shack toward the dark woods. As they crossed the threshold, Sterling saw the second figure emerge from the shadows of the nearby trees, Caroline. She was holding a crude oil lantern, its light casting long, dancing shadows. Her eyes, still placid and empty, met his. She was completely unfazed by the violence she had just witnessed. "The glasses, Papa," Caroline said, her voice clear and unnervingly flat. "He needs his glasses to see the trail." Elias nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the spectacles Thorn had dropped earlier, the ones with Caroline's hair on them. He tossed them on the ground in front of the shack, a final sadistic gesture of control. He won't make it far without them, Elias muttered, pulling the rope, forcing Sterling to walk. The path to the ridge is too steep for a blind man. As they moved, Sterling managed to look back at the shack. Caroline did not follow them. She simply stood there, holding the lantern, illuminating the glasses and the tracks of their escape. She was the anchor, the eyes, and the mind behind the plan. Suddenly, a realization struck Sterling, a piece of the puzzle that was even more terrifying than Elias's revenge. The oil residue on the spectacles, the musty, acrid smell in the shack, the charcoal drawing of the open eye. Caroline hadn't been guiding them to a robber or a killer. She had been guiding them to a mine. Not the one they were looking for, but an abandoned, secret place where Elias had been hiding and plotting for years. The acrid smell was from the deep, mineral-rich rock and the man with the shovel. He wasn't just digging a grave. He was tunneling. He was preparing the final claustrophobic trap. Sterling's terror reached a new peak. They weren't just being stalked in the woods. They were being moved toward a deep, dark underground space, a space where his guilt and Elias Vance's madness would finally meet. The journey through the deepening twilight was a nightmare of forced marches and agonizing clarity. Elias Vance, gripping the rope attached to Sterling's neck, moved with the tireless, assured grace of a man walking his own backyard. Sterling stumbled, his hands bound, his mind reeling from the guilt and the realization of the Vance's twisted plot. He looked back several times, hoping to see Caroline's lamp, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was more terrifying than her presence. She was likely moving ahead of them, a silent scout, preparing the next stage of the ambush for the fleeing Thorn. Elias kept up a low, unnerving monologue, not demanding answers but reliving his pain. You thought you could just take what the earth gave me. The earth always collects its due, Sterling. Always. They were ascending steadily now, climbing a steep, narrow path that only a local could navigate. The air grew thin, and the temperature dropped sharply. Where are we going? Sterling finally managed to gasp. To the place where you belong, Elias said, pulling the rope. Where your ambition led you years ago. They broke out onto a small elevated plateau far above the earlier fog line. The moon, now a cold sliver, illuminated the jagged horizon. And there it was, the Black Ridge. At its base, hidden by an overhang and a curtain of overgrown kudzu vine, was a dark, square opening, the entrance to an abandoned mine shaft. The air immediately filled with the damp, earthy smell of old tunnels and deep rock. This was not the lost zinc vein they sought. This was a smaller, older shaft, perhaps an unauthorized prospecting hole Elias Vance had been working years ago, or maybe the actual spot where the fatal blast had occurred, a constant reminder of his loss. Thorn ran this way. Sterling burst out, a desperate final plea. He did, Elias confirmed, turning to face Sterling, his face a mask of grief and obsession. He's trapped. He's right where I wanted him. You see, he's a collector, that one. He never discards anything. Sterling remembered Thorn clutching the bone and the newspaper clipping from the tin box, the only items Thorn had deemed important enough to carry during his escape. He has the relic, Elias stated. He has Caleb. And now, he has nowhere to run. Elias dragged Sterling toward the mine entrance. The rough, uneven rock floor inside sloped steeply downward, disappearing quickly into absolute blackness. We go in, Elias commanded. No, it's unstable, we'll get lost. Sterling resisted, digging his heels into the dirt. Elias responded by swinging his shovel, hitting Sterling's shin with the wooden handle. Sterling cried out and stumbled forward, the rope pulling him into the suffocating darkness of the mine. Inside, the silence was total. The air was cold, still, and suffocatingly dry. The only light came from Elias's own small handheld lantern, which he had pulled from his pack. The The passage was narrow, forcing them single file. The walls were rough-hewn rock, occasionally supported by ancient groaning timbers. As they moved deeper, Sterling heard a faint sound ahead. A choked, sporadic coughing sound, followed by the frantic noise of rock being scraped against rock. Thorn. He was trapped. Elias stopped, holding the lantern high. They were in a small, damp chamber where the main tunnel split into 3 smaller, terrifyingly narrow passages. He took the middle one, Elias said, his eyes glittering with cold triumph. The tightest, the one I know best. He was looking for a way out. He found his grave instead. Elias pulled a coil of thin, strong wire from his pack and handed it to Sterling. "You're going to help me, Sterling. You're going to call to him. And when he comes, you're going to give him this." The wire was copper, thin and strong, clearly a tripwire. "Why? Why not just kill him?" Sterling whispered, his throat tight with revulsion. "Because I want him to know why he is dying," Elias said, his voice dropping to a terrifying softness. "I want him to know that the man who ruined me delivered him to his end. You owe me that, Sterling." Elias pushed Sterling toward the middle tunnel. "Call him, Sterling. Tell him you have the glasses. Tell him you found a way out. He'll come." Sterling stood at the mouth of the tunnel, the smell of damp earth and stale desperation overwhelming him. He had 2 options: be killed immediately by Elias, or betray his last companion to a horrible, calculated end. He inhaled deeply, the shame and fear overriding his physical pain. "Thorn, it's Sterling. I have your glasses. I found a fissure, a way out. Come back, man. Hurry." The scraping and coughing stopped instantly. A moment of silence, then a faint, weak voice echoed back. "Sterling, is it true? The glasses?" "Yes. Come back. I'm waiting, but be careful. The tunnel is unstable." Elias smiled, a slow, cruel contraction of his jaw. Sterling waited, holding the copper wire loosely in his bound hands, his heart hammering. He could hear the nervous, scuttling sound of Thorn crawling backward in the narrow tunnel, driven by the desperate hope of sight and escape. As the sound grew closer, Sterling threw the wire across the tunnel mouth, creating a small, nearly invisible barrier close to the ground. A small, terrified man in a tweed coat emerged, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. Thorn's eyes were wide and frantic, his face streaked with dust and tears. He saw the spectacles lying on the ground. He lunged for them. As his chest passed the opening, he hit the wire. It wasn't attached to a bomb or a heavy rock. It was attached to a small, heavy wooden lever hidden behind a pile of rubble. The lever was pulled sharply down. A second later, with a terrifying grinding groan, the support timbers holding up the ceiling of the small chamber began to buckle. A heavy flow of loose rock and earth poured down from the main tunnel above, completely sealing off the chamber and the 3 passages with a cascade of suffocating debris. Sterling was thrown backward by the concussion and the blast of dust, the rope around his neck yanking him violently. When the noise subsided, the chamber was filled with dust and the 3 tunnels were gone, replaced by a solid wall of rock. Elias Vance had not trapped them. He had trapped Thorn, and he had used Sterling to spring the trap, locking his former partner in a tomb of rock, with the last sight being the face of the man who sold him out. "It's over," Elias said, his voice flat with finality. 1 down, 1 to go. The aftermath in the mine chamber was suffocating. Dust hung heavy in the air, tasting of iron and pulverized rock. Sterling was slumped against the damp wall, his hands still bound, listening to the horrifying silence behind the fresh wall of earth and stone. Thorn was gone, entombed in the Ozark bedrock, his end a final, cruel betrayal. Elias Vance stood over him, the lamp casting his shadow into a monstrous figure on the cave wall. He was exhausted, but a cold, unsettling relief settled over his features. "You delivered him," Elias said, his voice a dry rasp. "You paid the debt of the zinc, Sterling, but not the debt of the boy. He was part of the deal. Sterling pleaded, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He's the one who handled the funds. I told you everything. Money is nothing, Elias scoffed, his face hardening. The boy was innocent. You can't repay innocence with a trap. You repay it with suffering. Elias grabbed the rope and dragged Sterling deeper into the mine. They were no longer in the main shaft, but in a side tunnel, a narrow, crudely dug passage that led downward at a severe angle. "Where are we going now?" Sterling demanded, the claustrophobia now a sharp physical pain. "To the sanctuary," Elias said simply. "The place where I waited. Where I learned to hate you and your kind. The place that made Caroline." After 5 minutes of difficult descent, the tunnel widened into a small, dry cavern. It was surprisingly clean and illuminated by a series of small, oil-burning lamps tucked into niches in the rock. It was a dwelling. There was a rough-hewn cot, a pile of blankets, a small table made of old timbers, and, most chillingly, a meticulously organized shelf of tools. Ropes, small picks, measuring tapes, and a stack of notebooks identical to the one Sterling had seen in the shack. This was Elias Vance's lair, his home for the years he spent planning his revenge. And then Sterling saw the 2 other figures. Caroline was seated at the wooden table, the lamplight highlighting the unnerving placidity of her face. She was meticulously carving something from a piece of soft wood. And standing next to her, a shadowy, still figure, was a woman. She was thin, gaunt, her dress faded, her hair pulled back severely. She was holding a small silver locket. Elias's wife, Sarah Vance, the mother of Caleb, the lost infant. Sarah's eyes were the most disturbing sight Sterling had ever encountered. They were not filled with hatred, like Elias's, or empty, like Caroline's. They were filled with an all-consuming, bottomless grief, the kind that permanently shatters the mind. She looked at Sterling, but her gaze went straight through him. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She simply rocked back and forth, holding the locket. Elias unceremoniously threw Sterling onto the dirt floor. "Sarah," Elias said gently, but with a horrifying formality, "this is Mr. Sterling, the man who brought the blast that took Caleb." Sarah stopped rocking. She looked down at Sterling, and a faint, thin smile touched her lips. It was a smile of pure, serene madness. "You brought him to the fire, Elias," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "But only she can bring him to the end." She nodded toward Caroline. Caroline stopped carving and looked up. The small wooden object she had been carving was a miniature coffin. "Your father taught you to hate us," Sterling pleaded, addressing Caroline directly, attempting to find a spark of humanity. "But your mother, she needs help, not this revenge. You'll be consumed by this darkness." Caroline stood up, her small frame radiating an icy command. She walked slowly toward him. "You think this is about hate?" she asked, her voice low and clear. "You think this is what Papa wants?" She took a step back, her eyes fixed on Elias. "The truth, Mr. Sterling, is that Papa started the plan, but he lost his nerve," Caroline stated, her gaze unwavering. "He couldn't do it. He would have eventually given you the deed and let you go. The money would have saved us, but it would not have brought back Caleb. It would not have given Mama peace." Elias stood motionless, his shovel dropping slightly, his powerful frame suddenly looking vulnerable. "I found the journal," Caroline continued, holding up the notebook. "I found the plans, and I realized that the only thing that would save my family was to finish the job that he was too weak to complete." The stunning realization hit Sterling. Caroline was the true architect of the final, terrifying acts. She was the one who had driven Elias past the point of no return. She was the one who set the pace, laid the most psychological traps, and ordered the killing. She wasn't an accomplice. She was the mastermind. "I put the hair on the glasses," she said, her voice completely calm. I dug the trench. I showed Papa where the pickaxe should hang. I knew you city men would look for money, but you'd only find your guilt. She knelt beside Sterling, her face inches from his. Your final payment, Mr. Sterling, is the witness. You will watch Papa finally find peace, and then you will disappear. She reached out and, with unnerving gentleness, tucked the small silver locket from Sarah's hand into Sterling's bound hands. You hold Caleb now, Caroline whispered. You are responsible for him. Forever. Suddenly, the ground began to shake, a deep, unsettling vibration that rattled the lamps. A sound like a distant, immense engine filled the mine, a deep, resonant groan. Elias's eyes widened, filled with a sudden, overwhelming fear. The supports, the main timbers, the blast. The mine, weakened by the ceiling of Thorn's tunnel, was giving way. Caroline stood up, her face resolute. She grabbed Elias's hand. It's time, Papa. Elias looked at his wife, then at the locket in Sterling's hands, and finally at his daughter, his eyes filling with an anguished mix of terror and relief. He had created a monster of vengeance, and now she was guiding him to his fate. The low ceiling above them began to crack, raining down small pebbles. This story is not over. If you've been on the edge of your seat and want to see the terrifying conclusion to the Vance family's revenge and Sterling's fate, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. The final chapters will reveal the dark resolution to the Ozark nightmare. The rumbling intensified, transforming the small sanctuary into a terrifying, unstable cage. The mine was collapsing, and the collapse was not a random accident, but the final, terrifying design of Caroline Vance. Elias Vance, his face a map of sudden, raw panic, grabbed the shovel. He was momentarily freed from the hypnotic grip of his daughter's plan, reacting with the miner's instinct to survive. The cross tunnel, there's a small passage to the old ventilation shaft. We can make it, Elias yelled, his voice cracking. He lunged toward a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock wall, but Caroline grabbed his arm, her small fingers surprisingly strong. No, Papa, not yet. We have to finish. For Caleb. For Mama. Sarah Vance, the mother, had not moved. She sat on the cot, her eyes distant, her lips moving in a silent, prayerful rhythm. The silver locket, now clutched in Sterling's bound hands, was the focal point of their madness. Sterling, still bound, realized the horrifying truth. Caroline didn't intend to escape. She intended to die here, bringing her father with her, securing their redemption by turning the mine into a final tomb for all those connected to the tragedy, including the Vance family's own guilt. She's trying to kill us all, Elias. She's mad, Sterling screamed, struggling against the ropes. Elias looked from the desperate tunnel opening to his daughter's cold, calm face. The weight of 8 years of grief and plotting, the years he spent feeding his daughter the narrative of injustice, had culminated in this final, self-destructive act. He was no longer the master. He was the sacrifice. She's right, Sterling, Elias said, his voice dropping into a resigned sorrow. This is the only way it ends. We lost our soul in this earth. We must give the earth our bodies to balance the debt. But a flicker of the old man, the man who once loved his wife and son, the man who cared about his remaining daughter, flashed in his eyes. He couldn't condemn Caroline to death. With a sudden, violent movement, Elias shoved Caroline away from the fissure. No, you live. You have to tell the story. He raised his shovel and swung with all his remaining strength, not at the fissure, but at the main timber supporting the ceiling beam closest to them, a key structural support. The shovel hit the wood with a deafening crack. The timber groaned, then split. Immediately, a torrent of loose rock and debris began to pour into the cavern from the ceiling, completely blocking the small ventilation fissure, their only path of escape. Elias had eliminated their way out, ensuring his own death, but he had bought Caroline a few more crucial seconds. Go, run. The upper passage is still clear. "The one to the ridge," Elias screamed, pointing to the passage through which they had entered. Caroline did not move. She looked at the torrent of falling rock, then at her father, her expression now a mixture of betrayal and raw, human fear. "Papa, no, you have to come." "I can't, Carrie," Elias gasped, placing his hand over his heart. "I have to stay here, with Caleb and Sarah. Go. Live." Elias turned and, with a terrifying determination, began to pound the wooden cot and table, shattering them into kindling. He was preparing for the inevitable, hoping to use the rubble as a shield against the worst of the collapse. Caroline, seeing the full, horrifying commitment in her father's eyes, the sacrifice of a man who loved her more than his own revenge, finally broke. Her calm facade shattered, revealing the terrified girl underneath. She let out a single piercing scream and bolted. She ran not toward the collapsing exit, but toward Sterling. She grabbed the locket from his hands with a fierce urgency. "He stays here! He stays with the others!" she cried, shoving the locket into her own pocket. She then pulled a small, sharp trench knife from the sheath on her belt and with a few savage cuts sliced through the ropes binding Sterling's hands. "Go! Run! Tell them what you saw!" she spat, her eyes wild. "Tell them what happens when you steal from the Ozarks." Caroline then turned and ran, not up the main passage but back toward her mother, who was still rocking silently on the cot, unaware of the chaos. She was not escaping. She was choosing to stay. Sterling, his hands free but shaking violently, scrambled to his feet. The ceiling was groaning, the rocks were raining down, and the light was fading as the lamps were extinguished by the dust. He ran. He ran out of the cavern, up the steep, twisting entrance tunnel, spurred by the roar of the collapsing mine behind him and the memory of Caroline's final, desperate command. He ran past the rubble that had entombed Thorne, past the place where Elias had stood and plotted for years. He burst out of the mine entrance and onto the dark, moonlit ridge. The night air was freezing, but the cold was a welcome sensation after the suffocating heat of the mine. He did not look back. He ran down the steep, narrow path, driven by the absolute certainty that the entire Black Ridge was collapsing behind him. He ran until the sound of the rockfall was a distant rumble, until his legs gave out, and he collapsed in the mud, far from the ridge, far from the vengeance, with the chilling echo of a girl's scream and the memory of a madman's sacrifice imprinted on his soul. Sterling lay in the freezing mud for hours, his body twitching with shock and exhaustion, the smell of gunpowder and fresh dirt still strong in his nostrils. When the first streaks of pale gray dawn began to filter through the trees, he forced himself to move. His immediate objective was clear: Silver Hill. He needed civilization, light, and most urgently, a chance to report the truth. Though the truth was a terrifying tapestry of guilt, revenge, and madness that no lawman would easily believe. He was bleeding from cuts and bruises, his expensive city clothes ruined. He was no longer the arrogant prospector. He was a haunted survivor. He followed the logging trail he and Thorne had found, navigating by the faint light and the sound of a distant creek. He knew the Vances were gone. The entire top of Black Ridge must have collapsed, erasing all evidence of the mine, the lair, and the revenge plot. As the sun fully rose, casting long, stark shadows, Sterling reached the edge of the small town of Silver Hill. It looked idyllic in the morning light, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the rhythmic clanging of the mill starting up, a profound and sickening contrast to the horror he had just escaped. He stumbled into the local sheriff's office, a small, dusty building attached to the general store. Sheriff Brody, a large, grizzled man with a kind, weary face, was drinking coffee and reading the morning paper. He looked up, his jaw dropping at the sight of the bloodied, mud-caked Sterling. "Lord in heaven, man, what happened to you?" the sheriff exclaimed, immediately pulling his sidearm from its holster. "The Vances," Sterling gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "Elias Vance. He killed them. He killed Thorne and Graves, and he and his daughter Caroline, they trapped me in the mine." Sheriff Brody looked skeptical. Elias Vance? He's harmless, Sterling. Been that way since the boy died. And Caroline? She's just a quiet girl. Sterling frantically explained everything. The ambush, the fog, the psychological traps, the mind collapse, the terrible reason for the revenge, and Caroline's final terrifying role as the mastermind. He pulled out the key piece of evidence, Elias's notebook, its pages still smelling of damp earth. Sheriff Brody read the chilling, meticulous entries detailing the plan, his face growing pale. This is powerful evidence, Sterling. But we need proof. Where is the mine? Where are the bodies? Black Ridge, the old prospector's shaft. It collapsed. The whole ridge is gone. We have to get a crew up there to dig. The sheriff radioed his deputy and began organizing a search party. Sterling was cleaned up, given a cup of strong black coffee, and wrapped in a scratchy blanket. He was the sole witness to a horrific, calculated act of revenge, a survivor burdened by a profound and dangerous truth. A few hours later, the search party returned. They had found the location Sterling described. The top of Black Ridge was indeed scarred by a massive landslide. They found no entrance to any mine, only a solid wall of earth and stone. They found no bodies. The earth had swallowed them whole. However, they did find something else. Tucked beneath a heavy limestone rock, near where Sterling said the logger's shack had been, they found Mr. Graves's skull. It was clean, and there was no wound. The medical examiner later determined Graves had died from a broken neck caused by a forceful downward blow, likely from the pickaxe. The sight of the skull confirmed Sterling's account of the revenge, but it complicated everything. Without the mine entrance and with only one body, the story became a tale of a mentally broken man, Elias, and a disturbed girl, Caroline, who had murdered 2 men and likely perished in the collapse with the third, Thorne. Elias Vance and Caroline Vance were officially listed as the perpetrators, their disappearance a result of their own madness. The state seized Sterling's remaining land holdings in the Ozarks as compensation for the victims' families, effectively ending his prospecting career in the region. Sterling, the survivor, was left with his life, but his mind was irrevocably damaged. He carried the burden of knowing the full truth. He was responsible for Caleb's death, and the vengeful madness of the Vance family was a direct result of his ambition. A week later, Sterling was on the train heading back to Little Rock, a broken man. He was leaving the Ozarks behind, but the Ozarks were not leaving him. As the train pulled away from Silver Hill, he felt the weight of the silver locket Caroline had stuffed into his hands. The one she had taken back at the last second, the one containing Caleb's bone and the photograph of the dead infant. No, wait. She had taken it back. Sterling's hand flew to his pocket, touching the fabric. It was empty. He was certain she had retrieved it. He remembered her taking it. He opened his hand and stared at his palm. Lying on his sweat-slicked skin was a small, crudely carved wooden doll, the exact replica of the one he saw on the limestone ledge in the woods, with the small, silver pinhead eyes. The doll was warm. It wasn't there before. Sterling looked out the train window, his reflection staring back. A man who had just escaped certain death. But the horror was not the doll itself. The horror was what was pinned to the doll's small wooden chest, secured by a single rusty pin, a small yellowed piece of newspaper clipping. It wasn't the headline about Caleb's death. This one was much smaller and more recent, dated just yesterday. Local teen girl CV, seen heading south on train from Silver Hill. The doll wasn't a warning from the dead. It was a message from the living. Caroline Vance had not died with her family. She had slipped out of the mine, used the collapsed ridge as a perfect cover for her escape, and was now on the move, a silent, psychopathic survivor of the entire event. She had followed him. She had given him the doll, the witness, to ensure that the man who bore the guilt, Sterling, would never truly be free. Sterling let out a silent internal scream. He had traded his life for his sanity. He was a survivor, but his role was now clear. He was the next victim in a larger, unfinished game. Sterling stared at the newspaper clipping, his heart a frantic, trapped bird in his chest. Caroline Vance was alive. The last 8 years of planning, the cold-blooded murders of Thorne and Graves, the sacrifice of her own parents, it was all a brilliant, horrifying maneuver to achieve absolute freedom and continue her retribution, unburdened by her father's wavering conscience or her mother's madness. He crumpled the newspaper and the wooden doll, shoving them deep into his pocket. He could not show this to anyone. To reveal that the teenage girl was a cold, calculating killer would only solidify his own image as a disturbed witness suffering from trauma. He had already told the authorities a version of the truth, but this final, crucial detail was his alone. He was now a prisoner of his own survival, bound by the knowledge that the girl who orchestrated a triple murder and an elaborate plot of revenge was now hunting him. The train rattled on, carrying Sterling further away from the Ozarks, but closer to the next phase of his nightmare. He realized that Caroline had given him 2 things: his life and an absolute crushing certainty of his own guilt. She didn't want him dead immediately. She wanted him terrified, isolated and waiting. Back in Silver Hill, Sheriff Brody closed the case on the Black Ridge tragedy. 3 men confirmed dead: Graves, Thorne, and the disappearance of the 3rd, Elias Vance, and 2 missing, Caroline and Sarah Vance, presumed buried in the landslide. The town sighed with grim relief, attributing the horror to the darkness that still clung to the remote hills. But Sterling knew the darkness had followed him onto the tracks. He spent the next few days in Little Rock, holed up in a cheap, anonymous boarding house. He barely slept, tormented by the images of Thorne's panicked face and Elias's final sacrifice. Every knock, every shadow, every sound of a board creaking in the hallway sent a jolt of ice through his body. He tried to go back to his life, to his ledgers and accounts, but his hands shook too badly to hold a pen. His ambition, the very trait that had driven the initial crime against the Vance family, was now his greatest vulnerability. On the 5th day, he made a decision born of sheer desperation. He would sell everything, flee Little Rock and move west, disappearing into the anonymity of a new territory where the Vance name and the Ozarks were meaningless. He packed a single valise, withdrew all his remaining cash and went to the train station to buy a ticket to California. As he waited in the bustling station, a flurry of activity, the hiss of the steam engine, the shouting of the porters, the rush of passengers, offered a momentary sense of safety. He walked past a newsstand, the headlines of the Little Rock daily paper screaming about the coming war in Europe, a distant concern that felt irrelevant now. And then he saw her. Standing by the water cooler, dressed in an inexpensive practical traveling coat that masked her age, was a young woman. Her blonde hair was tied back severely, her face calm, and her eyes focused on the ticket counter. Caroline Vance. Sterling's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't hiding. She was simply waiting for the right moment. The newspaper clipping hadn't been a warning of her escape. It was a message of her arrival. He watched, frozen, as she approached the counter and spoke to the clerk. He couldn't hear the words, but he watched her movements, smooth, deliberate, and utterly composed. She finished her transaction, took her ticket, and turned to walk away. Their eyes met. There was no hatred in Caroline's eyes, no triumph, only a calm, patient recognition. She did not smile. She did not sneer. She simply confirmed that he was there, and that she knew he was there. She then walked slowly, deliberately, toward the platform for the train heading west. The same destination Sterling was hoping to reach. Sterling realized the truth of her method. She was not a stalker in the shadows. She was a parallel presence. She had attached herself to him like a parasite, planning to accompany him across the country, turning his entire existence into an extension of the Ozark fog, a constant, suffocating dread. He looked down at his own ticket, already purchased. He was boarding the train with his own killer. Driven by a final, desperate instinct for survival, Sterling spun around, dropping his valise. He ran toward the nearest exit, plunging out of the station and into the chaotic, unfamiliar streets of Little Rock. He ran blindly, not toward a destination, but simply away from the platform, away from the girl, away from the inevitability of the train. He ran until he collapsed in an alley, gasping for air, the noise of the city a meaningless roar in his ears. He had escaped the mine, but he had not escaped the Vance family's sentence. He was now doomed to a life of perpetual flight, pursued by a 16-year-old girl whose only motivation was the cold, unyielding balance sheet of revenge. The story of the lost zinc, the lost sun, and the lost souls of the Ozarks was now the story of Mr. Sterling, the man who ran for the rest of his life, a tormented, invisible ghost, knowing that somewhere, patiently waiting for the moment his guard dropped, was the quiet girl who led strangers into the fog and whose sentence was life.